Yeah, good evening, everyone. I think only the really interested ones have remained. Nevertheless, like Shakespeare said, every man has the life is a stage where every man plays his part. So we all have to play our part, even if there's a limited audience. This panel, I think, is basically going to discuss, at least in my view, the impact of geoeconomics on geopolitics rather than the other way around. And there are three components to this panel's theme: great powers, energy security, and connectivity. And each one of these terms is actually very loaded. We are witnessing several T's in the current context: turmoil, turbulence, and transition. And we live in a world where energy, trade, technology, all these relationships are becoming extremely political, and great powers are using these to leverage their influence and edge over each other. And I think when we talk of transition to new energy sources, that's also adding to the competition largely, because while the focus is on gas, hydrogen, etc., as clean forms of energy in much of the Western world, many Asian, African, and South American countries are pushing heavily into solar energy. They're pushing big time into biofuels as well. Even a country like India is mixing up biofuels with fossil fuels. And then, of course, there's the connectivity angle. Today, we just heard in the panels earlier that it's not just about physical road, rail, or sea projects. It's also about digital connectivity. We are in the cusp of the fourth industrial revolution, where artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, 3D printing are all having a great impact, and perhaps they will determine the course of geopolitics and geoeconomics in the future. And there is also this adage that we are perhaps living in an age where data is the new oil, right? And there is also the resource war to keep pace with all these tech advancements, because today we are not just restricted to connectivity on land, but also water and space. So let's see what you have to say in terms of these issues. To begin with, let's kick off with Dr. Tamas Dudlak from the ELTE University in Hungary. Floor is yours, 15 minutes.
So thank you for the invitation. This is my second time here, and I'm very happy to be here again, speaking about energy politics again, because last time it was Chinese energy policy towards Central Asia. Now it's Chinese energy policy towards Iran. Yes. Maybe I shouldn't say much about the timeliness of the topic, because there are many issues going on nowadays concerning this topic. So, for example, the reimposition of sanctions in 2018 by the US against Iran made this topic very actual. And also the Chinese and the Indian deepening cooperation in 2021, as well as 2023, exchanges of diplomatic visits. And the deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran maybe can transform the region in terms of energy policy as well, and energy cooperation as well. Also, the Iranian join of Iran to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is a new phenomenon, as well as the BRICS expansion, which will include from the beginning of the next year Iran as well as Saudi Arabia and other countries. So Iran is really in the forefront of China-related developments nowadays. And my aims for this research were to analyze the economic and geopolitical opportunities offered by the expansion of Iranian and Chinese energy relations. I will mainly talk about oil, a little bit maybe about natural gas as well, in terms of Iran and China. But I will focus on the question how China's energy policy reacts to the sanctions against Iran, because that's the crucial question here. Because according to the basic arguments that I use in my research, there are two levels of feasibility when we talk about common energy projects. One level is granted, actually, economic feasibility. I mean, if we see Iran and China, there is complementary between them. China is a huge energy importer. Iran can be a huge energy exporter. So there is no problem with the cooperation of the two nations in that regard. But politically, there are issues that complicate these matters. And I argue that, of course, the impact of the sanctions are there, and as well as regional and global players play a role in defining the feasibility of common energy projects. When I talk about common energy projects, obviously these are focused on Iran, because Iran is not a great investor in China, but China is the great investor in Iran. So projects are located in Iran. That's the main focus here. And in my presentation, I will also emphasize the pull and the push factors of the relations between China and Iran. Maybe I shouldn't talk much about the potential of the relations, because as I told you, Iran has huge capacities of oil and gas resources, and China is escalating demand for those resources. So they can really go together and cooperate on in these areas. The problem, or the problems, are the sanctions, really, because in general, the sanctions crippled the investment opportunities and the development of hydrocarbon resources in Iran and the Iranian energy infrastructure in general. And the threat of secondary sanctions by the United States deterred some Chinese firms from fully realizing their investment plans in Iran. And I listed many events, common projects between Iran and China, Chinese investment projects, really, in Iran. Maybe the most important of them is concerning the South Pars natural gas field. As early as 2004, they started to develop plans concerning Chinese involvement in the development of that natural gas field, but later on, the CNPC, the Chinese National Petroleum Company, had to pull out from this project because of the sanctions. Because sanctions started, I mean, energy-related sanctions started in 2010, first by the US, and then 2012 by the European Union. And from that point on, China delayed investment projects in Iran. They started it, as I listed in the previous slide. But as you can see, China had to step back a little bit, and it was a kind of delay for Chinese projects in Iran. And still, China remained relatively important even during the sanctions in Iran, because European Union countries after 2012 pulled out from Iran, and China and Chinese energy relations, as well as oil trade between China and Iran, remained less, but still very significant. Almost half of the Iranian energy oil exports at that time went to China. You can ask, how could Iran export to China in a sanctions regime? But I think we will have a special talk about that, how to evade sanctions, and China used those strategies very intensively. But still, the amount of trade after 2012 between Iran and China decreased in terms of oil. And in 2014, when the oil price dropped, that meant less income from Iran. So Iranians were not that much interested in trading oil in high quantities. But later on, when the JCPOA eliminated all the nuclear-related sanctions, there were this very positive feeling concerning Iran, and European investors tried to go back, and many of them went back to Iran to invest also in the energy-related sectors such as natural gas and oil and petrochemicals as well. But it didn't last long, as you know, because in May 2018, sanctions came again, only from the US, but still, because of the secondary sanctions, European companies are targeted if they have some dealings with Iranian partners in oil or gas or in any other fields. And at that time, China had to think over its activities. So, for example, the CNPC again left the South Pars natural gas field development, and China doubled down on the oil exports from Iran and doubled its oil import from Saudi Arabia. So that's an interesting one. Instead of relying on Iran anymore, after 2018, China relied on Saudi Arabia more than before. But nowadays we can see that the return of China in Iran. So, for example, in this year, the Iranian oil exports really skyrocketed. They achieved the best results of exports, oil exports, in the last decade, and 70% of that export went to is going nowadays to China. So there is a kind of a return to this to the previous very fruitful Chinese-Iranian oil trade. So we can see these ups and downs, but altogether there are pull and push factors that we can examine when we talk about the prospects of relations or energy relations between Iran and China. I don't want to deal that much with the geopolitical reasons. Both in China and Iran, they have this resistance against the US hegemony, so that force kind of pulls those powers together, as well as China is very beneficial for Iran because by China, Iran can mitigate its isolation in the international system. Ideological factors are there, pulling together these actors, just as the revisionism of China and Iran. They are different, but still they are revisionists in the international order, and they have some common norms as well that they can use to cooperate. But of course, economy is the most important one here. So as I mentioned, there is huge energy consumption in China and huge energy potential and production as well in Iran. But the potential is higher. There can be even more production in Iran if Iran's fields, oil and natural gas fields, are developed. And China has the capacity to invest, and Iran needs these capacities of investment and technology. So there is this complementarity between the two sides. And during the sanctions, we saw that China limited its economic activity in Iran. So as I told you, larger investment projects stopped because that was risky for China to go on. And also the oil trade decreased between China and Iran. And only small trade could really avoid sanctions. But even the smaller amount of oil trade between China and Iran is really important for Iran because China maintains some level of energy trade even during the sanctions, and these trade provides Iran really important currency sources. And technology transfer is going on as well, even in limited limited measures, but still those are really important for Iran. What are the push factors of the relations? Of course, we can mention that geopolitically, China's vision of the Middle East is different from what Iran is planning to do in the Middle East. But concentrating on the oil and natural gas trade and energy relations, economic asymmetry is the most important issue here, because we should consider that China and Iran are partners, but not equally important to each other. So, for example, Chinese trade with Iran is only accounted for 1% of China's total trade with the world. So you can imagine that only 1% of the total trade is total trade of China is with Iran. And even if trade relations are significant and they have significant from an Iranian perspective, less significant from a Chinese perspective, and it is growing, but still it grows from a very low basis, and it is less compared to the neighbors of Iran. So China trades more with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and other countries, and these trade relations between Iran and China is dominated by hydrocarbons. In terms of investments, you can see even more asymmetry between these two countries. China is the #1 investor in Iran's energy sector, but on the other side, there is almost no Iranian investment in China. So Iran depends on how China's domestic capacities to invest abroad develop. So if China is not in a good shape to invest abroad, then Iran doesn't get investment from China. And China is the biggest investor in Iran. So you can imagine this kind of asymmetric relations. And even in terms of energy, you can see the asymmetry. So Iran provides only the 7th largest amount of oil for China in 2022. But for Iran, China is the most important oil export partner. So you can also see in this figure that they are not equally important to each other. And of course, there is the problem of the sanctions, because China not just lowers its investment and trade with Iran during the sanctions, but keeps at a lower level. But also China utilizes the dependency of Iran. China can go for a better price when sanctions are ongoing against Iran. And Iran must use some Chinese banks for transactions, producing even more dependency of Iran. And I would also say that there is no real loyalty between the partners when it comes to the periods after the sanctions. So, for example, after 2015, when the sanctions were about to ended, Iran went back to the European partners to trade with them more in terms of oil as well, not to China. And after 2018, China replaced the Iranian oil with Saudi oil, as I mentioned. So there is really no loyalty in the relations between the two partners. Do I still have time? Okay. Okay, 2 more minutes, so I can also talk a little bit about natural gas, specifically because I mainly concentrated on oil until this point. So Iran's greatest problem is that they don't have LNG facility to export oil, just like Qatar or the UAE or Saudi Arabia. And that's a big problem because they can either rely on LNG or pipeline. And the problem of Iran is that the pipeline trade with China is dominated by Turkmenistan. That's one neighbor of Iran. And the LNG trade with China is dominated by Qatar. Again, one more neighbor of Iran. So Iran is surrounded by neighbors who are competitors of Iran in terms of natural gas as well as oil. So Iran is really in a bad position to develop natural gas relations with China. As well, it's also valid for the oil relations, but at least in the oil market, Iran has some share already. In the natural gas market, Iran has very limited share in terms of exports because most of the production is consumed by the locals, Iranians. And if we think about the prospects of Iranian natural gas exports, for example, to China, it can go through a pipeline through Afghanistan, for example, not the best place nowadays to have a pipeline through all the way to China, or it can go through Turkmenistan. But as I mentioned, in Turkmenistan there is Turkmenistani natural gas fields that are consumed by China. So Turkmenistan is not really interested in to involve Iran in those businesses. Or it can go through Pakistan. Through the Gwadar port, for example, there is an LNG port already in operation, but that can be also problematic. So yeah, I think we can discuss that later. Okay, so I will jump to the conclusion. So as we can see, after all the sanctions, in 2010, 2012, and 2018, China was really reluctant to maintain its high profile concerning the energy relations, mainly the oil trade. So it's delayed or canceled investment projects in Iran and lowered the oil imports from Iran. But Iran is still a very useful partner for China because Iran resists the US pressures not to transport oil to China. And Iran is more dependent on China than, for example, Saudi Arabia. So Iran could be controlled more by Chinese interest in terms of oil. China could also benefit from Iran's dependence on oil exports, so they can bargain for better prices if Iran is under sanctions. And however, China relies on Iran's neighbor more. So you can see there is this really good relations between Iran and China in terms of, I mean, the relations are really cordial between the politicians, but China is more focused on Iran's neighbors than Iran itself. And with that, I will thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Thomas. I'd like to challenge you a bit in the Q&A because I think empirical data suggests that China slowed down in terms of getting oil from Iran, but there's evident anecdotal data which suggests that there were circumventions that China introduced and Iran introduced to ensure that there was undetected supply of energy resources between the two countries. We can talk about it a fair bit. But again, the question remains whether sanctions really worked or not. And I think we will have a presentation in terms of how that circumvention took place. But it's also very important to remember for all of us that we overemphasize Iran's reliance on oil for its revenue. I think some conservative estimates suggest that only a quarter of its revenue comes from oil resources. So it has other resources, it has other ways of getting enough revenue. So the entire sanctions regime haven't really worked out. But I quite agree with your takeaways in terms of a combination of economic and political factors having worked out in terms of the Iran-China relationship. You know, one must also bear in mind the 2021 comprehensive partnership agreement that the two countries signed. I mean, undisclosed or unconfirmed reports suggest that it's about $450 billion. So we must wait and see over 20 years if that will actually materialize or not. Yes. That said, let's move on to the next round, and we'll have Dr. Ioana Constantin-Bercean. I'm sorry for my pronunciation. And she comes from the Brătianu Institute of Political Science and International Relations, Romanian Academy.
Thank you very much for your generosity, but I think I'm going to be under 15 minutes because my colleague here from Hungary, he said like pretty much half of my presentation. So here then my purpose is to criticize you then. I'm a non-traditional researcher, actually. Thank you very much for having me here. My main interest in research is Iran. I have 2 PhD theses on Iran. Not that smart, I just look, but I'm not really that smart. So, as the title says, Sino-Iranian ties toward the strategic equilibrium or pragmatic partnership. Our colleague here from Hungary, I hope I'm not mistaken, he presents, yeah, you're from Hungary. We are neighbors, I'm from Kolozsvár. So, actually between China and Iran, there are more relations than those related to oil, as you very well mentioned. And let's not forget this. In this relation, China is the singing lady. China is the main actor. Iran just come across, and we can say that between China and Iran, there is how to call it, a marriage of convenience. I really don't, I told you I'm not quite an orthodox researcher, so basically sometimes I do relate to this kind of quotes. So can we move on to the next? Oh, I have this one, yeah. I told you I just look smart, I'm not really that smart. So where?
The big part.
The big part.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So basically, this is supposed to be a research article. So you have a context, which is introduction, methodology, and some chapters. Hopefully, it's going to be a great article somewhere. We have in the first, when I defended my first PhD thesis, all over worldwide, there are only 3 books written related to Sino-Iranian relations. My first PhD thesis was not even on this relation, but it was kind of around it because it was dedicated to nuclear diplomacy, you know, those 10 years from 2003 to 2015 until the JCPOA has been signed. So basically, I have a huge chapter there which presented the relation between the nuclear diplomacy actually between China and Iran. But at that time, only 3 books are written there. Many articles. I really want to thank you, Professor, for your materials and congratulate you for all these books on this topic. Because I'll tell you this, in Romania, my country, there is not a single book related to nuclear diplomacy, to Iran purpose or ambitions, so to say. And one might say, yeah, but Romania is not quite a big country. Maybe its diplomacy is really not taken into account. But My purpose as a researcher is also to provide to decisional factors, to decision-making factors, some insights, but also to the public, because the general public quite often is very misinformed about what is happening in this side of the globe. We just read some newspapers with breaking news, China did that, Iran did that, but we don't go through the real thing, so to say, because as we are standing now here, and yesterday after all this interesting presentation, we are speaking about the new superpower of the 21st century, and on the other side we are speaking about a new multipolar world, but we do not us here. I would say in Western, or maybe in Western Europe, Eastern Europe, somehow we do not pay enough attention to what's happening. China is coming, China is rising, whether we like it or not, and we have to learn it. And we have to learn China's relations, not only with Iran, but with the entire Middle East, and also European Union. Because if President Biden met President Xi Jinping, that's quite a big deal. We really don't know yet what they spoke, what they planned, but they met. And that's just 1 year before the general election, presidential election in the United States. And for those people with open mind, that should mean something. It's a real meaning in that. So coming back actually to our topic, we have this rhetoric about ancient civilizations between these two actors, China and Iran. Interaction, common oppression, Western hands, and so on. The contemporary scholarship on the Sino-Iranian relations tends generally to drift toward the contrasting lines of the argument. We have these two perfect partners, close companions, I don't know really what I know, matches, I would say marriage of convenience, cordial comrades, or allies, and so on and so forth. And the second one, I think I'll read from here, the Iranian-Chinese interaction are maintained to be merely a limited partnership, and you explain a bit their ups and downs. Mismatched relationship, I would argue that, but this is a quote. Marriage of convenience, as I said, fair weather friendship, unlikely affiliation, and so forth. Okay, no more. The analytical framework, I'm not going to bore you with this. I just have these 3 central factors of my research paper. The involvement of the great powers in the Middle East, where China wants to take the leading role in the Middle East because it's in proximity. And not only because of that, interstate relation in the Middle East region, because whatever happened between China and Iran, it's affected by the developments, security developments, economic, diplomatic developments within the Middle East. And nowadays we see that we do have an ongoing war in the Middle East, which affects actually everything what is happening there, and maybe the future partnership and relations. And China's long-term strategy, we have to think about this, because every time when I'm asked about what China wants, my first answer is this: we are trying to figure out from 500 years what China wants, because China's strategies are not from 1 year to another. They are very long-term strategies. We do remember that in 1960s, Henry Kissinger had a very good intuition on this, and he actually advised President Nixon to open to China, because Kissinger at that time, he foreseen that China is the next competitor for the United States, not the former Soviet Union. So he had a very, very good actually and real intuition, because we see it now. China is the rising superpower, or accordingly to other scholars, it is already the superpower. A bit about the spirit of Sino-Iranian relations. I have here that history, politics, and security thinking are deeply intertwined in China, in Iran, as they are in other countries. Yet the 3 strands of the existing literature on the country's security policy rarely meet in adjunctions within a book or a research paper. So this article which I'm going to write, is trying to decipher the nature of this relationship, even starting from their old ancient spirit. So China-Iran cooperation and the United States, we know that everything was happening worldwide. It has somehow, somewhere, a footprint of the United States, because as we've seen in the previous presentation, sanctions, coercion, sometimes even hard diplomacy, you know, is coercing some states to follow one path or another. So what happens if the US condition will force China, through sanctions, not militarily, of course, to give up or reduce its relation with the Islamic Republic of Iran? And how will the war between, this is the second question, how the ongoing war in the Middle East will affect the Sino relations in the near future? About economic ties also, it's good I didn't put here that many slides because you presented them very well with up and downs. But the most important thing, what happened between these two countries, is that 25 strategic cooperation agreement. Okay, there is not much developed yet from it, but as I said, and as you all know, China is thinking on long term. So Iran might be even used as a proxy for China's interest in the Middle East. And however, whether we like it or not, Iran accepted, because Iran doesn't have many other options at this time, being under sanctions, being a rogue state, quote, and being a non-allied state. So Iran's options are, so to say, maybe a bit more limited. So this relation with China is accepted by both Beijing and Tehran as it is. Of course, the bigger winner in the picture for the time being is China. Some of the exports, 5 minutes. You have also this slide in your presentation. Also, this is the 25-year comprehensive cooperation agreement. A bit more, but I'll just jump to conclusions. What was China's role and or will in the great power competition over the Middle East? Because as we look, not during the Cold War period, but most probably even more after the end of the Cold War, the Middle East became, in one way or another, not only the hottest spot on the globe, but also the most important, because the Middle East retained 2/3, if not more, of the natural international resources. So basically, when we are speaking about extrapolating or extending influence, we are speaking first in economic terms, because you cannot extrapolate our powers only through war, because through war, we don't get it. We look at Iran, at United States in Iran, in Iraq and Afghanistan. The gain from Iraq and Afghanistan, it's pretty low. I'm not the one saying, I'm just, I can argue on it, but the withdrawal from Afghanistan brought nothing else but another, so to say, mess in Afghanistan. And here China aims to play a role, even through Iran, using it as a proxy, but not through military means, but economic and diplomatic means. And Iran can do this because both China and Iran, they have a great diplomacy and a great school of diplomacy. So is this relation between China and Iran a strategic equilibrium? I mean, is China trying to use Iran to maintain a peaceful and security environment so China can prosper and evolve economically speaking, and so it can develop its relation and ties with the entire Middle East, the extended Middle East? Or it's a pragmatic partnership in which both actors are using each other for pragmatic realpolitik purposes. China can use Iran, for example, to rebuild Iraq, Afghanistan, not to mention Syria, which is an ongoing process, and maybe when this war in Syria, if it will ever come to an end, China can invest a lot in Syria, but it's very well known Iran's influence and means in Syria. So China can go through in Syria through Iran. So we have to think also in these terms, and also in Lebanon, for example. I do have this information, I can verify it, but honestly, I overheard that, for example, the port from Beirut, which exploded, you know, the disaster for a couple of years ago, actually is rebuilt under the umbrella of this agreement between China and Iran with some offshores from Israel. So if we look at this Middle East map, every single actor has its importance. China understands this and is using also Iran to go within the Middle East through Iran, and using it also to keep this peaceful environment, because we know sometimes Iran can produce some, so to say, sparks in the Middle East. So I hope I was not too poetic on this one, and I want to thank you very much for your attention. As usually, I'm writing a lot here and I'm reading nothing of it, so I hope I did quite all right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna. I mean, some of the takeaways there were, of course, the Sino-Iran ties being linked to civilization and power. I'm glad you mentioned the 25-year strategic cooperation, because there's a lot of, skepticism about it. And also that the Middle East is now a theater of great power competition, China playing a big role, energy, technology, connectivity, all linked out there. And the fact that you mentioned the US's hasty withdrawal from Afghanistan as a factor, because I think it definitely did contribute to the declining US stock in the Middle East. And in fact, there was an alternative quad that kind of developed, an informal alternative quad at that point, which is Russia, China, Iran, and Pakistan, basically to stabilize Afghanistan, because all of them had some interest or the other in Afghanistan. And also the fact that Iran is one of the nodal points of BRI, and that's why China is interested in ensuring that there is de-escalation in the region to ensure that its interests are maintained. Thank you for your observations. And now let's have Dr. Connor judge, and we'll have some interesting observations from him in terms of the circumvention of oil sanctions.
Thank you.
And he's from Ashoka University,
Yes.
and he's also affiliated with Harvard-Yenching Institute, China Studies, and he's a postdoctoral fellow.
Yes, thank you. And to add to that, I am teaching and researching at Christ University in Bangalore. So it's a complicated affiliation, but
he represents all the connectivity projects that are taking place.
I am so happy to be here again in Armenia after 5 years in person, and I must take the opportunity to thank the organizer, Dr. Mihir, for bringing us together. Could we please get a round of applause again? Thank you. So it is due to you, my friend. So thank you very much. I feel like my paper speaks very well to the paper by Tamas here. And I think that a lot of similarities in interconnections are going to come out in this paper. But I was called to kind of answer the question about energy sanctions circumvention strategies, which are not in my presentation framed as strategies, but I can list them. The first is prices. I checked Ural's crude yesterday, and it's trading below the price cap coalition of $60. It's trading below $60. So what's the point in even having a price cap if this doesn't limit the flows in real terms? The other is different stages in the refining process. Russia can export crude oil to a country, and then the refiner can do 1 or 2 steps and then export it onward to the the countries that are adhering to the sanctions. The other is a ship-to-ship transfer, STS, and we've seen a 200-something+% increase in STS transfers, I think globally, This can only be explained by Russian tankers transferring the oil to other tankers. And then the fourth strategy is laundromat countries, okay? And there are two types of laundromat countries. There are laundromat countries where Russia will export the oil to a country that needs its energy for its own purposes, and then can refine it, and then can distribute it to its market. And then there's another kind of laundromat country that produces its own oil. And I think this was mentioned earlier. These countries will use Russian oil for their domestic purposes, freeing up more oil and petroleum for export. So if we can add any more possibilities to these sanction circumvention strategies, I'm happy to discuss them. My paper is going to look at the theoretical framework. It's been mentioned geoeconomics, and I frame it slightly differently as economic statecraft, but essentially we're talking about the same thing. I'll talk about India's market response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, China's market response to the invasion, other important dynamics and conclusions. And a bit about my perspective. I'm not saying any of this in order to undermine Russia, for example, because if we look at Russia, Russia needs oil and gas revenues in order to survive. Without oil and gas revenues, Russia will implode. And if it implodes in such a unlikely but still possible circumstance, what do we have? We have a country with the largest nuclear arsenal that can't maintain airport security in Dagestan and allows people with anti-Semitic tendencies to get into critical infrastructure. What if they had access to such nuclear weapons? So I think that we need to correct Russia on its behavior, but we do not want regime implosion, okay? And I feel like China is kind of an expert at making sure that regimes don't implode, okay? A few examples of this: North Korea, Iran, as has been mentioned, and now Russia is filling this space. China strategically wants to keep Russia afloat whilst maintaining its energy security, but it does it in a measured way, which I'll go into. So I am in India, based in India. I am not Indian. So a lot of the oil and gas industry in India is new to me. But what I can see in India is that Russians, they don't realize what a good friend they have in India. There are many pro-Russian narratives in India to the point that the work almost does itself. Any Western criticism of India's increased imports of Russian energy are met with such narratives. India is helping the Western consumer. India is refining Russian energy, and of course refining is very polluting, right? You don't want to have so much refining activities in Europe, so you just export such industries to China and India. Another narrative that has come out in my discussions in preparation for interview is noting the hypocrisy of the West, because we're in a cold climate, we need gas, and gas has not been sanctioned by the EU. So the Indian observer will say, well, this is quite hypocritical of you to say that, why don't we adhere to your oil sanctions when you are not sanctioning gas? Okay. I'm sorry. So I can go back. Yes. I won't talk about this in great detail. Petrostate is kind of a derogatory term, but Russia shares this characterization with a few other countries. They are dependent on resource flows and also wielders of resource flows for political and economic purposes, but more practically, 20%, 25% of Russia's GDP and 60% of exports contribute up to 40% of government revenue, something like that. Maybe someone can correct me on this statistic, but it's a direct link from the export of oil to the state coffers, which are being used to finance wars and military activities around the world. We've mentioned the RIC Troika, and I think that this second quotation explains it best. It's the three countries, Russia, India, and China, taking common positions on selected, but not the most important issues. And I don't think that there's collaboration between India and China vis-a-vis this Russian oil issue directly, but indirectly through the market. And then, of course, there was the Raisina dialogue in New Delhi, where Sergei Lavrov gave a speech. He was laughed off stage for other reasons, but he said that the RIC Troika continues to function. So at least Russia is somewhat aware of this need to continue to develop ties in India. And I can reassure, the Russian side that that's going to be very easy to do that in India. Two theoreticians of economic statecraft. The first is David Baldwin. He has categorized positive sanctions. We hear a lot about negative sanctions. There are also positive sanctions. One type of positive sanction is direct purchases, which I claim that India and China are using to support Russia. Whereas William Norris, he's written this very long book about, very good book about China, and how this confluence of state-owned actors, state-owned financial organizations work together to make acquisitions globally in order to ensure China's energy supply is undisrupted. Okay, and this proves to be a very effective strategy, and China has a lot of experience in doing this. Even in Russia, there was this big $25 billion loan to Rosneft. The China Development Bank deal enabled China to more than double the oil it was receiving from Russia, diversifying from Middle Eastern sources of petroleum, which was seen as a security issue for China. That was more or less successful. China increased its share of Russian oil imports. And I feel like now is the time to take this theory further than China. And even the author himself says, this is usually framed as Chinese exceptionalism, but many debates can apply equally well to discussions of Russia, India. States like Russia and India may share a similar scale and domestic political, economic characteristics to China that make it more likely for the theory to travel well in those empirical contexts. So I'm going to start to do this, and to my mind, I see we have a dependent variable, which is a measure of energy security, and then we have multiple independent variables, such as something like the price cap coalition, such as global oil prices, that may affect what we're trying to measure. And the reality is, in India, I explain my research. I'm comparing China and India, and they laugh at me. They say, why, how can you compare two fundamentally different industries? Well, the statistics speak for themselves, because India and China are now importing up to 80% of Russia's total crude oil exports. And this is important for security reasons, because in such force majeure scenarios, I won't go into all of them, but from what I can see in the North Atlantic, if NATO blockaded the Baltic Sea, India would experience a sudden shortage in its crude oil imports, whilst China is less exposed due to its pipeline, overland, and Far East sea connectivity with Russia. China has therefore, in this case, more effectively used economic statecraft tools. The punishment narrative was also mentioned earlier. If India continues to participate in the Quad and things like AUKUS, Russia could use this as a pretext to punish India at a certain point. We have different motivations, and this is very nascent, but I can see that India may be interested in ensuring energy security and promoting business and promoting economic growth. But it's interestingly not so concerned about Russia's intentions to use energy as leverage. And it doesn't really care about Russia's, battle with the United States and NATO. Whereas China is interested in ensuring its own energy security, modestly improving industry, stabilizing a strategic partner, and undermining the United States in lockstep with Russia. But China is wary of Russia's ability to use oil and gas as leverage. So China has effectively diversified its portfolio in a more meaningful way. And of course, all ignore decarbonization in this context. We're seeing that the US and China are cooperating on decarbonization. If you throw Russia into the mix here, I'll leave that open. And this is the statistic, the big statistic. This is the financial year starting in April 2022. We see that Indian imports of Russian crude oil shot up very dramatically, and then the year-on-year increase is for 2022 to 2023 is 1,150%. In value terms, 1,000%. Whereas before the war, Russian crude imports into India were about 1% because the route is very long and very costly. Russia's share of the pie increased to 19%, and in half one of 2023, it's increased to 35%, could be higher. I won't go into the notes, but energy insecurity. India imports roughly 85% of its total crude oil usage and 50% of its natural gas usage, which leaves it very exposed. Global crude imports to China have increased 14.4%, but the value has dropped 7.7%. So at least in value terms, China has got a discount. Some of this can be attributed to discounted prices of Russian crude oil. China imports 72% of its crude oil and 41% of its gas. So already it's less exposed than India. And then I queried the customs of both India and China many times. And I averaged the months. And we see that Russia has replaced Iraq and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to be the largest exporter of crude oil to India. And this is not a perfect measure because the demand changes in half one and half two, but we could see somewhere upward of $4 billion monthly. Yes, 5 minutes? 4 minutes. Okay, that's plenty of time. So again, Russia is the largest exporter of crude oil to India. And then China. Previously, Saudi Arabia was the largest crude oil export partner to China. And before that, it was Russia. Now it is Russia again. About $5.86 billion a month. India imports approximately 1.76 billion barrels per day from Russia. China imports approximately 2.27 million barrels a day from Russia. And almost all of India's flows are seaborne, whereas the difference in China's statistic is pipeline. I talked a bit about laundromat countries. I don't want to name and shame, so I'll only talk about India and China. But we can see 3.7 million tons are going out of India to the price cap coalition, and 3.0 million tons are going from China to the price cap coalition. One such interesting statistic is that now India is exporting roughly $15 billion in petroleum products annually to the EU, which is a market increase. Part of that increase is due to a lot of India's refining capacity going online, but now they have the crude oil in order to back it up. And then a statistical anomaly. We see the Netherlands was India's third largest export destination. The jump in Indian outbound shipments, especially petroleum products, resulted in a $12.3 billion trade surplus with the Netherlands in 2022, meaning the Netherlands is the third largest trade partner of India. And these statistics match very well. Just this map very briefly, we see that China is less exposed because it has pipelines, and the Kozmino port it can export crude oil very easily to China. Whereas the picture for India looks quite more difficult. You have to go all the way out of St. Petersburg, and then you have to go through the Strait of Gibraltar and then down through the Suez Canal before you end up in a refinery in Gujarat. And it's been under discussion that this Eastern Maritime corridor between the counterparts in India and Russia, but that's still tentative. All of this increase is going along this main route. You can transport, 1 minute. You can transport oil by rail freight, but it's 2 to 3 times more expensive. And this is where Iran comes in. And this is where the International North-South Transport Corridor, which I hope my colleague will elaborate on, you can transport oil on this route too. The Jamnagar refinery and the Sikka port are the largest exporters of refined Russian crude oil, and some of it does go to Pakistan. One MP, Jawar Sikar, he reported that 2 private Gujarati refiners, he reported them to the MEA but didn't name them, but there's only a few private refiners. And he was condemning this for, how can we be supporting this, this war by buying Russian oil? But that doesn't matter. I think it's more a battle between the public refiners and the private refiners. And then I just have, if I may be permitted, just one slide for the conclusions. Russia has become India and China's top supplier of crude. They both export similar amounts of laundered petroleum to the price cap coalition. Russia's share in India's market has grown dramatically. Russia's share in China's market has grown modestly, not dramatically. It's more measured. Refining for export, in India's case, does not contribute to India's energy security because the private refiners are reaping the lion's share and not passing the savings on to the consumer. India is reacting to market shifts, and India's response may leave it vulnerable to leverage, whereas China has more experience in dealing with Russia. And then the last point is that Russia's lack of scruples in supplying Pakistan with oil and LPG may further securitize the issue for India, and I can see that that's where the trend is going. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thank you, Connors. I think Russia-India 1,150% increase would have been even more had it not been for the discounts, right? And the Russian oil refined in India and then being exported to Europe also makes a mockery of the sanctions. And you are right, India's energy supply diversification isn't as good as China, but it is increasingly looking in that area. It's going into South America a fair bit, Africa quite a bit. And you were talking in terms of how Russia could perhaps punish India for its Quad membership. I think India has moved one step ahead and has tried to counter that by actually watering down the entire Quad security dialogue. It's no longer called Quad security dialogue anymore because the security component of Quad has been removed. So India is trying to build bridges with China to ensure that China doesn't meddle in India's affairs in its neighborhood, which it has the capacity for through Pakistan, etc. And the strategic importance of Russia to India is something that people don't realize. 65% of India's arms come from Russia. So that's a very key component as well. And it's not just China and India that are friends of Iran, but South Korea and Japan have also been playing a very, very equidistant sort of role in that area. And a few other sanctions beating systems that were adopted is the barter system. Buying oil for rice, for example, and also finding banks that did not have exposure to the US dollar. That was another key factor. And yeah, so that said, let's please move on. I think we don't have Dr. Yana Dong here with us, so we will move to the last speaker, which is Yeghia Tashjian from the Issam Faris Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut in London. And he has some interesting observations on Russia, INSTC, regional trade interconnectivity, and the future of the Middle East. The floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone. Once again, thank you, Dr. Meher, for inviting me. This is the second time. I remember first I came in 2019, and I presented actually about Iran and China energy security relations, which I later turned into my master's thesis. So hopefully my presentation will be my PhD thesis in the future. And also, I'm happy actually my so basically, my research is a small section of a publication that I'm working about the battle of corridors. And also, I'm happy because I have quoted two scholars here, Dr. Meher, about the north-south route, and also Dr. Tubaba when it comes to the middle corridor. So I'm happy that two scholars, actually, I have quoted them in my research here. Can I? Oh, okay. I'll be brief in 10 minutes or so. Okay, so quickly to talk about why Russia, the international north-south corridor and the regional interconnectivity and the Middle East. So actually, this idea came after the 2020 war in South Caucasus. And my argument was that we cannot understand Russia's position in the region, or from the Armenian perspective, Russia's passive position in the region, without also analyzing the key developments in Middle East, mainly Syria. Because the Turkish-Russian, which I call co-opetition, which like neither cooperation nor competition, in Syria, like it was to some extent also replicated in the South Caucasus. So basically, quickly, what is the international north-south trade corridor? First, there are three corridors in this section. So mainly, I will talk about the western route, which is like connecting Caucasus to the Persian Gulf or the Middle East. Actually, it was initiated in 2000, mainly by India, Iran, and Russia. So basically, before the idea of the Belt and Road Initiative came. And also, if we will try to compare it to the Suez Canal, actually, it was like much faster and to some extent feasible. But of course, there were a lot of challenges, mainly dealing with the sections when it comes to Iran. So here we see in the map, my colleague here talk about the Eastern Maritime Road. So basically, if we will compare this route to the maritime route, also it's to some extent was more stable, because now we're seeing the Houthis in Yemen. They are trying to take over control over Israeli ships coming from India to Europe. So to some extent, this route from the red was much more feasible. However, the developments in South Caucasus were not letting to be more operative. Dr. Tuba, she published a paper in the SWP, so I took this map from there. There were mainly three corridors in the region when it comes connecting China to Europe. The ocean route was like very long and very costly. There was the northern corridor, but however, after the war in Ukraine, it was sanctioned. So the only feasible corridor connecting China or Asia to Europe was the middle corridor. However, from the also later, especially after 2022, the Russians started to push more about the north-south corridor, because to some extent they also saw the middle corridor was a rival to their north-south corridor. So first we have to analyze and see the literature review of the Russian publications, especially the Valdai publications. And also when I was in St. Petersburg a few months ago, almost all Russian scholars, they said that the north-south corridor is an existential to us. It's very crucial because it was the only oxygen that can help Russia to have a connectivity with the outside world. So there was very interesting publication by Evgeny Vinokurov. He's a Russian economist. His idea was that, okay, the north-south corridor is not just about South Caucasus and Russia, but also it's beyond that. It's also the Middle East. He came up with the idea of also connecting the north-south corridor to the Baku-Tiflis-Gars railway. And this is how we have to understand later that why Russia also wanted to control the routes, the trading routes in Syunik, that is in southern Armenia, because within the Russian perspective and the Russian idea was that we have to make interconnectivity between the north side and also the rival corridor, which is the middle, so that Russia can have later leverage also not just on Armenia, but also on Azerbaijan and on Turkey. Another actually publication again by Valdai was on the Middle East and the future of polycentric world, where basically two Russian scholars are they came up with the idea that, okay, if Russia wants to become an influential actor in the Middle East, then also we have to have a gateway to Syria. Because first of all, Russia's also position in the region will increase. And also let's not forget that there is a military base, which is the only military base in the world which is outside the post-Soviet era, which is in Syria. So the Russian perspective, there is two objectives here when it comes to north-south connectivity, connecting to the Middle East. First, it is a geopolitical objective, which aims Russia to consolidate its political and the military presence in the Middle East. That is, by engaging in regional interconnectivity, Russia will establish more military bases in the region and also become an active player in the region. And it's very interesting also that exactly after October 7, the escalation in Gaza, Russian newspapers started suggesting ideas that maybe Russian observers also should be deployed in Gaza, and maybe the Russians should also bring the Palestinians and the Israelis to make a peace agreement. So Russia was trying to come up with certain proposals. And of course, the geoeconomic objective is to increase trade activities in the Middle East and integrate the transport infrastructure in the Middle East. And here it's very important that one of the key obstacles to the realization of this project, which passes from Syria, is the American troops that are based in northeastern Syria. That is why in this late months, we have also realized there was intensification by the Iranians to target American bases in Syria, because the presence of the American base was the only obstacle to the realization of this corridor. So now also talking from the Iranian perspective and how the Iranians, they also view this interconnectivity, connecting the South Caucasus to the Middle East. Lately, the Iranians also engage negotiations with the Syrians and the Iraqis to rebuild the railway. The negotiations with the Syrians, I mean, for now it is impossible because of the Caesar sanctions we have in Syria, and also still there's security problems, and I said the presence of the American base in Syria. But when it comes to Iraq, it seems that the Iranians and the Iraqis are moving forward. So from the Iranian perspective is that they have to have an access to the Mediterranean, to the East Mediterranean, also to consolidate their military bases that have in Syria. So we're seeing that the Iranians and the Russians almost they have a parallel view when it comes to interconnectivity in the region. Now to talk, because I'm a Lebanese, so I will be a bit smart and to talk about Lebanon. The Belt and Road Initiative and the China, and also again how Lebanon, small country, very complex country, is also trying to have a small share in this project. So the Chinese actually, when the Beirut port exploded, the Chinese came up with these proposals and said that, okay, maybe in the future when it comes to reconstruction of Syria and so on, Lebanon can play a role. And the ports of Lebanon, especially in Tripoli and Beirut, the Chinese will reconstruct, and they will also build a railway connecting Beirut to Tripoli and to Syria. The Iranians were very happy. The Russians were, of course, very happy, but the Lebanese said that, sorry, the Americans are not letting us. Even though they were like $2 billion investment, but because of American pressure, Lebanon didn't have the courage to go forward with this idea. So here we're saying how also the Americans are to some extent pressuring and making obstacle to the realization of this corridor. From the Russian perspective, so if we make a zoom out of the map, we see that this is the vision of the Russian interconnectivity in the region, connecting South Caucasus to the Middle East via Iran, and from the Iran, then we're heading towards Syria. So literally in the future, the East Med will become much more geostrategic location important compared to the Black Sea, because Russia can easily bypass the Black Sea, and they will have a base, they will consolidate their military base in the East Med. Now here it's important also to talk a bit from the Armenian perspective that why Azerbaijan is becoming like important geoeconomic player when it comes to connecting the Middle East and South Caucasus. If we will compare the infrastructure between Armenia and Azerbaijan, to be very fairly, Azerbaijan was more, has updated infrastructure and railway, which can connect also Russia to Iran, unlike Armenia. However, there is a small section, which is almost 164 kilometers, connecting Astara to Rashid in Iran. This railway actually still, it's not operational because the Azerbaijanis couldn't invest there because of the sanctions. Putin last year, when he visited Tehran, he promised to provide funds. However, still, if this railway will become operational in the future, then for the first time, Russia will have access to the Persian Gulf to the railway. So this will enhance interconnectivity in the future. And this is how we can analyze also Russia's passive position towards Azerbaijan when it comes to escalation in Nagorno-Karabakh. This is an Azerbaijani map, and also I quoted Dr. Tuba in her paper in the SWP when it comes to the middle corridor. So from this map, we analyze and understand that why Russia wants to control the trade routes in Sunik, because not just they will have an influence in the north-south corridor, which already they have, but also by connecting the middle corridor to the north-south corridor through Armenia. And also, let's not forget that the railway in Armenia is managed by the Russian company, not directly by Armenia. So basically, the Russians will have a leverage, and they will also have a leverage politically in the future on Turkey, because from their perspective, they see that the middle corridor, and also the Iranians, they see it as a NATO-oriented corridor. So basically, they are trying to contain any project that NATO or Turkey can move forward. So this is the Russian perspective. And now a big rival for this corridor is actually in September during the G20 summit, the Americans initiated or backed the IMEC, which is the India, Middle East, Europe corridor. This was a major rival because it bypasses Russia, Iran, and also Turkey. And President Erdogan, he said that clearly, I don't want any corridor to bypass Turkey. So this is why actually the Russians and the Iranians and Turks, if not happy, at least to some extent, what is happening in Israel and Gaza is in their interest, because the conflict in Israel has jeopardized all this corridor, which is to some extent very feasible because the infrastructure is almost there. Finally, to conclude, so basically, if the north-south corridor in the future will become operational and connect the South Caucasus to the Middle East, means that for the first time, actually, Russia will have a railway access to the region and increase its or consolidate its position in the East Med area. Second, also Russia's dependence from the Black Sea will decrease, and actually its position, especially it will increase in the East Med, where it's also rich with natural and special energy resources. Third, in the long run, with the economy comes, of course, politics, and Russia is trying its best to become a peace broker. Although its position to some extent is shattered in the South Caucasus after the failing of the peacekeepers in Nagorno-Karabakh, but also is trying to play the role of peacekeeping, especially when it comes to now the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And also Russia was very happy to see the Chinese broke the deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran, because both these countries will become members in the BRICS, and also they have their influence in the Middle East. And finally, by establishing the INSTC, Russia and the Eurasian Economic Members will have access to the Persian Gulf and Asia. So basically, after politics also comes economy, and also like it's related, both geoeconomic and geopolitical developments are related in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Yeghia. I think, central to the INSTC is, of course, the Chabahar port. And I think there will be a lot of politics that will come into play out here. So far, the development of the Chabahar port was restricted to a large extent because of the US sanctions. But the US has waived those sanctions now, and India can proceed with it. But there's a new problem. Iran has expressed doubts about the viability of Chabahar port if the Gwadar port is going to be also developed at the same time. So there could well be some sort of conflict of interest in terms of what Russia wants and what China wants, and Iran may actually get caught up in that in the future. Right. I think we'll have, I don't know, I can't see Maher out here, but I presume we have about 10, 15 minutes, so we can go ahead with the Q&A. Yes, Professor Gardner.
Thank you very much. Still, I apologize for my voice. I have a little cold now. Thank you. That was very precise and very detailed presentations. But I do have more general question. First of all, Ioana, sorry for that, but it's a side issue. I did some research on Kissinger and Nixon. Basically, it was Nixon who advised Kissinger to develop a China strategy, and Kissinger turned it around in his memoirs, and that he convinced Nixon. Pardon? Yeah. So, but Nixon was conceptually not very developed, so it was Kissinger who really mapped out the strategy. But the idea came from Nixon. So, but I have a question to this Iran-Saudi deal. It was, you mentioned it very briefly, but I'm still asking myself, what are the real motives? Basically, it embarrassed the US and the European Union because it was China who did this mediation. But what are the real motives? If listening to all of you, I could find out the bits and pieces for each of the argument. Was it to create stability in the region? Was it economic motives, economic, or as Thomas said, there was a lack of loyalty to create loyalty? Was it to undercut the Abraham Accords, which basically sidelined China, get influence of the US? Or was it also just to get more influence, but influence not in military terms? So this must be only a diplomatic coup by China. So this argument, the vacuum, to fill the vacuum, what vacuum? So what I know everybody would say a little bit of all of them, what I'm saying, but I'm always looking for the driving cause of so what was it?
Yes, thank you for the very important note on Nixon and Kissinger. Actually, yes. I'll just take a chance to answer or to try and answer to your question related to the drive behind China's gesture to take the crown, I would say, about this rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. It's not militarily, definitely, but I will put it this way. The rapprochement or this relation between Saudi Arabia and Iran actually has not been brokered by China. China is the one who took the grant for it, but actually it has started, as you all know, in Baghdad years back. And then it has been taken via Oman. We know in Muscat, we know Sultan Qaboos and his heir, there are famously diplomats who also broker some deals between the United States and Iran in the midst of some misunderstanding, I would dare to say. So basically, Iraq and Oman were the ones who brokered really this deal. Now, as I see it, China knew and felt that this is going to lead somewhere. And because we do witness this competition among Pax Sinica and Pax Americana, and as Pax Americana, it is declining. I'm not the one to criticize, but it's an obvious fact. I think China wanted to step up to impose its diplomatic skills, its Pax Sinica around the region, and there is no ideological and military reasons behind it. but maybe economic, maybe also to undermine a bit Abraham Accords, which as we speak, they are dead with the war in between Israel and Hamas. But it was, so to say, a preemptive strike from China to override the American diplomacy and so on and so forth. So basically, I think it was just an imagological gesture, and China gained as much as it could from it, because as we all know, as we've seen, everybody is referring to China broker a deal. Not China broker a deal, but we are referring to it as such. And there are few concepts or definition in which we define a superpower. And one of it's being a diplomatic superpower who brokers these kind of deals. So basically it's not, I don't think there is like an exhaustive explanation, but as you said, it's a bit of each. And for one moment in time, China was the main superpower spoken around the world about. Thank you.
Maybe just quick also to make a comment. I mean, I second all the thoughts, but also like, let's not forget that there were protests in Iran. So there was necessity also from the Iranian side, because the Saudi media was a lot of like talking about human rights violations in Iran, and posting videos about how the Kurds and Arabs were trying to rebel against the Iranian regime. So there was also a fear. And also Yemen was becoming a big problem for the Saudis. It was a failure of Saudis' vision, and the MBS he had this vision of 2030, so he wanted investments. And after Khashoggi's murder, so the Saudis wanted investment. The US was not going, so the only option was China. However, the main case study will be Yemen. And so if there will be a economic resolution in Yemen, then we can say that this normalization will be successful. If the conflict will be prolonged, it means that it's a failure. But to some extent also, like, in order to expand the BRICS, there should have been normalization between the Saudis and the Iranians. Otherwise, you cannot invite both and import a conflict in the BRICS, which already maybe, if Venezuela attacks now, there is an island crisis. I think it will have a big impact on the BRICS. So the main was security and stability, I can say.
Thank you. My name is Charlington from Free University of Berlin, Germany. So since both speakers have talked about the Sino-Iranian relationship, so I have one general question. Actually, the former US National Security Advisor, not Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, has written in his book in 1997 that China, Russia, Iranian strategic alliance is probably the worst geopolitical scenario for the US. So it seems that the triangle strategic alliance is emerging in Euro continent, right? So for me, it's very interesting. It's a sort of Cold War 2.0. And from geopolitical perspective, this is a classic struggle between maritime power, US, and the continental power alliance, China, Russia, and Iran. Three of them are located in Eurasia continent. So any comments for this scenario or possibility?
Very quickly, I have a bit reservation when we use the term alliance to describe the relation between China, Russia, and Iran. Because when we say alliance, it's more institutionalized. Something like, for example, China and Iran would say, I will join the CSTO. Something will never happen. Never happen. Also, if we see in Syria, yes, there was a military and intelligence cooperation between Iran and Russia, but there was also competition, and also there were assassinations within the Syrian army and intelligence, because some Syrian officers were loyal to Iran, or the militias to Iran, and others to Russians. And there is, in the future, the security institution in Syria will become an outcome of the competition or the cooperation between Iran and Syria, and Iran and Russia. Even in South Caucasus, there was like to some extent competition and divergence of ideas. The Russians, when it comes to the so-called Zangezur corridor, the Russians were not opposing it, at least publicly they were, but the Iranians were opposing it. Even they threatened that we will intervene if Azerbaijan will attack southern Armenia. So there was divergence. I mean, that's why I have hesitation when it comes to using the term alliance. We can say a strategic partnership or cooperation because there is a common enemy, which is the US for now. If one day, if the nuclear negotiations would have been successful and Iran was open to Western and the US market, maybe instead of heading to the east, Iran would have been more close to the west, maybe, or at least in the center.
Oh yeah, maybe I can add because I'm totally agree with your assessment of the situation. We cannot really call these three powers as allies. The partnerships are not institutionalized, and if we want to distinguish their relations and their reactions to different issues, we have to distinguish, I think, at least two levels. So there's this global level. At the global level, against the American hegemony, they try to cooperate, and there are instances of cooperation. But at the regional level, when it comes to the Middle East, for example, there can be, you know, these instances of competition as well between these powers, and the same can be applied to Russia and China. The bilateral relations can be analyzed in these two levels, and you can get different results. I mean, at the global level, you have China and Russia cooperating. But in terms of regional issues, for example, in Central Asia, I can also refer to my upcoming publication concerning Central Asian energy policies. You have competition between China and Russia. So the relationship between them is really complex. That's one more evidence that cannot really say that they are allied with each other. So they're as solid as, for example, NATO members.
And let's not forget the China-Russia competition that may come about even in Africa, because I think both of them are, you know, aiming to influence the same set of factors. So there is a growing competition even between China and Russia and Africa, and maybe in future in South America, who knows? Yeah.
I know the relationship between the three powers are very, very complicated. But I think it depends on the U.S. foreign strategy. So if U.S. is pushing the three countries too much, maybe they have no choice but to build one strategic alliance. I mean, the ball is on U.S. court.
Yeah, sure. Last question, please.
I'd like to ask Yeghia Tashjian. You mentioned that the infrastructure was ready for this India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor. Am I? Yes, right? You have said that. Yeah. Which infrastructure and how? I mean, okay, now with the war in Gaza, the plans are interrupted. But how feasible you see it once the conflict ends?
Yes, when it comes to transport, that is the highways, already it is there. Yes, railway is also when it comes to UAE and Saudi Arabia. The only option was to connect Israel to Saudi Arabia. That is why there were secret negotiations. And after October 7, it was halted. That is what I said, that the war was a victory to Iran because the Iranians didn't want this. And also the maritime route, which passes from Yemen, also now it's not feasible anymore because the Houthis are trying to hijack the Israeli ships.
I think we need to end this, but let me just answer a bit of what Professor Gardin asked. I think it was rooted in pragmatism, the Saudi-Iran reconciliation, driven, of course, by Oman and Iraq first, and then China picked up the pieces as a big boy came into the picture and hijacked it to some extent. But the logic basically for the GCC countries was, and for all of them, is that if you can't beat Iran, join it in some form. They're co-opting Iran through economic, incentives, which China can guarantee, which the Americans cannot. So I think it's one of those pragmatic policies that's moving forward. And as much as you want to write off the Abraham Accords, Ioana, don't think it's buried yet. The Abraham Accords, I think it's in a state of coma. So partly because the Abraham Accords has other manifestations like the I2U2 and the IMEC. These cannot just be buried. So A may technically be in coma, but these projects may move forward in some sense, and there will be some political reconciliation that happen. We can talk outside, but just as we move forward, I think it's important to remember that while we've been talking a fair bit about bilateralism and multilateralism, we must also focus on minilateralism a fair bit. Increasingly, we are beginning to see that bilateralism is reaching saturation point. Multilateralism is not yielding the sort of results that and both are very formal mechanisms. So there is increasing focus on minilaterals, plurilaterals. These are informal arrangements, and they are very, very economic oriented. They are partnerships, they're not alliances, and we'll perhaps see a lot more of these in the future. Thank you, panelists, and thank you, audience, for your rich presentations and your rich interventions. Let's just put together a hand for all of them. Thank you.